Please join me in welcoming David Blood.
Oops. I was getting rid of the microphone. Jeez Louise. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Tony, for the appropriately short, in fact, could be shorter, introduction. I was reminded when I was thinking about this event about my own journey to finance, and I will confess it was not a straight journey. I actually, as Tony mentioned, I went to a small school in upstate New York called Hamilton College. And I went there actually with the intention of being either a forest ranger or a teacher. And as I arrived, I realized that really the forestry courses were minimal, so I decided to be a teacher. And I got through halfway through my sophomore year, and Hamilton disbanded the education department. So I looked around for a major that was closest to education, and I found psychology, and then decided to be a child psychology major, which, as it happens, was the perfect discipline to manage investment bankers and investment managers. But being a child psychologist wasn't actually straightforward to get a job, and I struggled to find my career. I actually applied to get my doctorate in psychology, but was rejected. I then, having grown up in Brazil, thought, well, maybe doing something in the emerging markets in poverty would be a good idea, so I applied to the Peace Corps and was rejected. You have to understand the Peace Corps is a volunteer organization, so being rejected for nothing is not, it was a blow, and so my father, worried that I was going to come home and live with them, said, you know what, banks have training programs, maybe you ought to consider banking. And so this was the spring of 1981, and I applied to 70 banks in the United States of America, including many around here, and I was rejected by 69 of those banks, but got one yes at the Bankers Trust Company of New York, and that's how I got into finance, completely by accident, as it were. And then spent a couple of years at Bankers Trust and went on to the Harvard Business School, and spent my summer at a firm called E.F. Hutton. And this was in the summer of 1984, and it was probably the worst possible experience that I could have imagined. I was working many, many hours. There was no sense of culture, there was no sense of ethics, there was no sense of client. It was just a terrible experience. And I went back to school thinking, well, finance is it's really not for me. I need to find something different. And as I went through the autumn thinking about what it is I might want to do, I kept coming back to the fact that actually finance seemed to be the only thing I was good at, and I really needed to try to reconsider that. And what I discovered actually was, or that my hypothesis was, that actually maybe I joined the wrong firm. And that if I could find an organization that matched my values and what I thought were my skills and how I liked to work, that it was possible that maybe I could find an organization that I would do well at and ultimately have a successful career. So this was in the autumn of 1984. Incidentally, that's an important year for me because that's the last time the Detroit Tigers won the World Series. And so I am familiar with waiting for these sorts of things. And I did an analysis of every single investment bank in the United States and some outside the United States, an analysis of the culture of these organizations. I tried to understand what drove the success, what was the commitment to clients, et cetera, a full culture analysis. And it was actually relatively easy to do because you had lots of firms coming up to campus. You had lots of people who you knew interviewing at these organizations. In any event, I did this analysis and ultimately concluded that Goldman Sachs' business principles, certainly at that time, were consistent with what I wanted to do, and I joined Goldman Sachs. The reason why I tell this story is it begins to leg into the whole conversation around sustainability. What I learned at that time is ultimately sustainability, in this particular case, the understanding of how culture operates in a human capital management business was a great lens, a great tool, a great indicator of the long-term success of those organizations. And what I discovered over the course of a long career in finance that continues is that many of the organizations that have failed in my career in finance, it was ultimately clear that they would likely fail because of failures of culture. When you think about it in the fact that, or I guess since 1985, Salomon Brothers has gone out of business, Lehman Brothers has gone out of business, Bear Stearns has gone out of business, Drexel Burnham has gone out of business, Baring Brothers has gone out of business. The list is quite long. And in every instance, it was a failure of sustainability, a failure of culture, a failure of ethics, a failure of governance. And so I say that as an introduction to make it very clear. When we established Generation, we felt very strongly that sustainability, ESG, was a lens to help us make better investment decisions. We integrate sustainability into our investment process, not because we're trying to impose our values on the portfolio, not because we think it's a great marketing tool. We integrate sustainability because we think ultimately it allows us to make better investment decisions. And I was reading an article this morning where the statement was essentially, ESG is an investing framework, it's not a product. And we categorically believe that. And what I want to do is set out what that investment framework is, what the business case is around it. I want to touch on fiduciary duty, and then I have 5 actions that I think we need to consider over the course of the next handful of years as practitioners of finance. So the investment framework that we use at Generation is relatively straightforward. It has a macro overlay to it, or what we call the drivers of change. What we noticed in 2003 when we started our journey was that sustainability issues and challenges were becoming ever more important in the world and ever more important in capital markets. Issues like poverty, issues like climate change, issues like of water, health, demographics, etc. These issues we were certain would become increasingly complex, increasingly interrelated, and would therefore ultimately affect business, primarily because, one, governments would not have enough money to address the challenges, and while civil society was important, they too did not have enough capital to address the challenges, and therefore we as citizens would ultimately require that business would be part of the solution. And it is clear, again, that sustainability issues are drivers of change in business. So as a backdrop, then we begin to think about the micro, the company-specific aspects of sustainability, of ESG. And we're very broad in terms of how we consider it, but it really comes down to 3 primary ideas. The first is a risk management tool. What we know is that great investment managers tend to avoid great mistakes. And we're not yet a great investment manager. I hope one day we can say we are. But we do recognize that sustainability is a really interesting tool to avoid great mistakes. And I think that that's categorically accepted now in the global investment management sphere. If you can avoid investing in businesses that drop a lot or dump a lot of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, that almost always is a good idea. If you can avoid investing in a car company that mislabels its miles per gallons because they are trying to meet certain regulatory requirements and they are not able to, that ultimately is a good idea to try to miss those investments. Same for the question around investment banks. If you can avoid investing in businesses that ultimately have a corrosive culture, that almost always is a good idea. So risk management, understanding holistically what are the long-term drivers of those organizations, that is a really interesting and important tool across all asset classes. The second is around resource management. We know we live in a resource-constrained world, whether that be human capital management, whether that be water, whether that be climate change or the environment. If you find organizations that tend to understand the resource constraints and operate their businesses to minimize the use of resources, almost always that is a very positive thing from a P&L perspective. It leads to lower costs and therefore potentially higher profits. And it also tends to be a very good indicator of management quality, which turns out is a pretty important determinant of success of businesses. And lastly is we look for businesses that use their products and services to drive or to address the challenges of sustainability, whether that be poverty, whether it be water, the transition to a low-carbon economy, multiple aspects of all of these challenges. If they can use their products and services to address these challenges, very often they can drive interesting revenue opportunities, interesting and more importantly, competitive positioning, and therefore competitive advantage. So it's this framework that we use to deploy capital, and we've been lucky for certain over the last, nearly 13 years, but we've also been able to generate some very interesting results for our clients over these years. And so I think it brings me to the point that I've already made, but let me underscore. Sustainability, the business case for integrating sustainability into investment processes are robust, they're significant, and they're increasingly proven. And the academic research that many of your colleges and universities support this point of view. This is no longer just something that somebody's been thinking about. It, in fact, is absolutely categorically real. And given that these issues, sustainability issues, drive the long-term success of business, it is your fiduciary duty to incorporate them in your investment processes. It is not acceptable to say that climate change is a long-term issue and therefore it's not part of our consideration of how we manage our portfolio. You are not fulfilling your fiduciary duty. So if you believe that sustainability factors, either risk, resource management, or opportunities can affect the long-term success of business, it is your responsibility as fiduciaries to incorporate those issues into your investment processes across all asset classes. So what are the 5 actions that I think we need to think about? The first is we do need to win the fiduciary duty argument. If you're interested in promoting sustainability, that is a critical component. Turns out that the Department of Labor this past year has come out in support of it. Turns out that in the United Kingdom, same thing. And actually, this is old news, because in 2005, Fresh Shields put out a point that actually argued very clearly that fiduciary duty, sustainability was part of your fiduciary duty. But it's critical, particularly in this country where there seems to continue to be a lot of folks who wonder about this, it's critical that we win the argument on fiduciary duty. It's critical that we always focus on the business case of ESG or sustainable investing. It gets into big problems if we view this only as values. Now, I actually think that sustainability also promotes the long-term success of economies, and we will ultimately do the right thing by people and the planet. That's clearly part of our mission. That's what drives us in many respects. But the business case is critical, and we must always return to the business case. Thirdly, and one of the reasons why I'm glad to be here, is I think higher education institutions can be critical to the success of promoting sustainability and therefore sustainable economies for 2 reasons, really probably 3. The first is the research that colleges and universities can deploy to continue to make this case is important, and it's important that it be a fair discussion. Pros and cons, sustainability doesn't always guarantee outperformance, incidentally. And of course, the endowments that you all manage are important laboratories, or in fact, I guess, demonstrators of the commitment to sustainability. And certainly, if your research says that it is relevant, the portfolios that you all manage on behalf of many stakeholders for many years to come should be managed with sustainability as a core component of the investment philosophy. Fourthly, and fifthly, these 2 are issues that are sort of outside of the conversation you all are having around the integration of sustainability into investment processes, but I can't actually not talk about these issues. The first is a transition to a low-carbon economy. This is a big opportunity, and it's a big risk, and it's a big deal. Everything that we've done today will need to change pretty significantly over the next 5 to 10 years if we are to achieve what the Paris Accord sets out. which is to limit temperature rises to less than 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C. Incidentally, that comes into effect on Friday. That comes into effect on Friday, which is an extraordinary statement in and of itself. This will be the most significant economic transition in history. It is a great opportunity to deploy capital. It is a significant risk, and it has to happen very quickly over the next 5 to 10 years. If we are meeting in 5 years' time and we have not begun the transition to a low-carbon economy, we're in big trouble. And lastly, the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals are around climate, but it's also about human well-being and poverty alleviation. Being dyslexic is not always a straightforward thing, I would say. Big words are a problem for me. But in any event, we have to think very carefully about how we're addressing the challenges of inequality as people in finance, as well as poverty. We are desperately close to losing our license to operate in finance. There's no question about it. Those of you who are in the endowment world, it's probably safer, but those of us in the investment management world or investment banking world, our fellow citizens cannot tell the difference between a hedge fund manager, a private equity manager, a sustainable investment manager, or investment banker. We're all in the same box, and we are perceived to not be adding value to our communities. We better figure out how to address that, to protect our license to operate, but more importantly, to have a positive impact on people's lives. That's what Brexit is about, and in some respects, that's what this election in the United States is about. So that's a long way of saying we do need to make sure that we bring back to finance a best practice, a recognition that finance can be a force for good, and that we in the investment community can be leaders in that. And of course, I can't think of a better place than academic institutions to be leaders.